Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Brokus, and along with Carlos Welch, I host the Thinking Poker podcast. What you are about to watch is a free preview of a hand-for-hand review Carlos and I did of my deep run in the $10 million guaranteed Venom tournament on America's Card Room. Carlos and I have about 25 years of professional poker playing experience between us, and we're also good friends who love talking poker with each other. So what you will find in this review should be both educational and fun. If you do enjoy the preview, there's another 10 plus hours available at www.nitcast.net. That's nitcast.net. And if you use the bonus code VenomTV at checkout, you can get an additional 25% off for watching this preview. Enjoy. I late registered this by quite a lot. This is still not quite max late registration. I think there's maybe even like an hour left on late reg, but this is when I was starting up everything else that I was playing, and you can see I still have like 35 big blinds. That's how, I mean, I know you commented later on like how deep this was, where, you know, people had 200 big blinds like well inside the money. But
yeah, if I remember correctly, I think you might have late res like 5 hours into the thing or something like that, and it's
more than 30, that. It was like 6
still
hours.
Get 30 bigs.
Yeah,
this is crazy.
So this is like, you know, the floptimal kind of charts I think are pretty helpful in this situation in terms of being balanced. Like, I think this is a fairly difficult spot to balance as a human. This is one of the few, like, playing from the small blind against what I'm assuming, I mean, there were a lot of weak players in this tournament, but overall, like, it was a $2,500 online tournament. You know, it was a reasonably tough field. So I'm not necessarily assuming like an unknown person in this tournament is going to be a particularly poor player. And I think like playing, if you're going to try to have like a limping range from the small blind, that's an extremely difficult thing to balance as a human. And so understanding like what kinds of hands go into a limping range, and maybe even doing some randomizing. Most spots I tend to, even if you were to look on a solver and see that it's supposed to be some kind of mix, I often think you're better off trying to guess one way or the other. And especially for short stack limping spots, I think just trying to go purely on heuristics, you're going to end up having too many limp folds. There's a ton of hands that look like this, where you're like, oh, well, getting like 5.5 to 1, you know, it's worth a small, you know, a call. But then like there's really only a few hands that are natural traps, like the very biggest pairs, maybe some of the big suited aces. But there's a lot more sort of like natural limp folds than there are natural traps. And when you actually look at a solver range, I mean, it's trapping with hands like ace-9 suited, king-queen offsuit. You know, its traps are not just the most obvious hands that don't really mind it checking through. And you have to have a lot of limp calls if you're going to have a lot of limp folds that look like this. I also think even here, like, you can play exploitive, but this is like my second hand in the tournament. I didn't really know anything about this person, but like there's still a lot of room to play exploitatively here. If you know that the person's going to fold too much to shoves or shove too much versus limps or something, I mean, there is a lot of room to deviate from those. But I think the average person probably does not limp enough in this kind of spot generally.
I agree with that, but I also agree with the average person does not call correctly in villain's shoes. I tend to jam a lot in these situations, because when I've looked at the calling charts, they tend to like the worst hands that they're supposed to call with aren't natural calls for most people. So I try to exploit in that way. But I get, and that's because I'm a little bit less comfortable playing post flop. So I think you can probably go either way. I'm curious what you think about an unknown person in this tournament. Like my maybe this is me projecting, but I'm thinking people are going to be a little bit less likely to call off with, like, say 9-8 suited or something like they're supposed to call off with here, maybe in a $2,500 tournament. But who knows if that's accurate?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question of 9-8 suited folding. I would wonder about, like, I don't know, probably like queen 7 offsuit or something. You know, like with him only having 8 big blinds, I think some of the very weakest hands he's supposed to call with might look more like that. And I don't know. I mean, we are still in the re-entry period. He knows he's very short.
That is true.
So yeah, I mean, it's also not hard for someone to just look at one of those charts. I think when it comes to pre-flop shoves, especially in like a larger buy-in tournament, I tend not to do not that the shoving here is necessarily like overly exploitative, but I don't like in a live poker, I'm a lot more inclined to do something like that online where I know someone can literally just like look up the answer to this. And surprisingly many people don't do that, but it's easy enough for someone to find a good strategy here that I'm not really inclined to go like deeply exploitative in these kinds of spots.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So I did that just folding. There's a lot of discussion for a limp fold, but anyway. So I am going to, even though I'm, we'll focus on hands that I VPIP'd, I think it's useful to look at some folds that I made, maybe even including this one, because I think there are some things, even some spots where I could have open raised and didn't. But, against like a fairly short under the gun opener, I think King Jack offsuit is already, it's just a tricky hand. I mean, you're going to miss a lot of flops, even when you do hit the flop. You're often dominated, but really the biggest problem is having this 10 big blind stack behind me. I think that this ends up being a mix. If we were just look at like a 25 big blind floptimal chart, it's like a mix of calls and folds. And that makes me, in this actual situation, which is not exactly the situation that like a solver is modeling, having a short stack here, this person is going to shove much more often than a 25 big blind stack would. And that reduces the value of your call, of course, because that I don't even really want to stack off against him, but I certainly don't want him to like reopen the betting and then Suze can shove and then I have to fold.
Right. I agree with this one. Now, quickly, are you looking at this basically as you're just playing your default game right now, or because I see you do have some stats on some players?
Yeah, I wonder if I have this. Oh, it is at the time of hand. Okay, I wasn't sure if these were because some of these people I played with later in the tournament as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, or even if
you're
it's
wanting
not,
to watch to get notes on other people.
No, not necessarily, because like that's what I would do in a soft tournament. But I'm kind of viewing, like, for me, this is a spot where I'm gonna probably play GTO just because there's a much bigger buy-in than I'm used to, and on a much tougher site than I'm used to. But for you, I imagine that you're gonna have more experience with these people than me, and just have more experience with these type of people than me. So you can maybe find some exploits that I can't. But it seems like you're kind of taking the same approach I'm taking right now, at least, which is just kind of like playing your default game.
Yeah, that's how I came into it. I was playing a couple. I think I had maybe 2 other tables going at the same time. So I was not. I was giving this one by far the most attention, and I was trying to watch more so than I do in a typical tournament to like get notes on people and things. And I think a little later in the tournament, I probably will slow it down and roll watch some hands that I was not involved in as well.
I will say, to be fair, just kind of like quickly skimming the HUD stats, none of the VPIP and PFR combinations are sticking out to me as like super fishy. So this probably is kind of like a tougher table.
I mean, this is kind of an outlier in terms of being highly loose and aggressive, but not like 37 is high, but it's not 60.
Yeah, and loose and aggressive from that stack size is probably appropriate.
Yeah. So not a lot of folds, big blind facing a small blind raise, but this is one of the very worst hands there is. So.
Yep.
And I think many people are overly tight in Madonna's shoes, if anything. This is maybe a slightly interesting one.
Yeah. My default would be to fold.
Yeah, that's the way I went as well. It's really tricky. If this were like live poker and we could look and see that this person were doing the fold hold or something, maybe. I mean, even then, I don't know if it's that appealing to shove. But the added risk of this person waking up with a hand, like as a 25 big blind stack opening from like somewhat early position. I mean, they're going to have a better hand than nines. I guess there's an outside chance you make them fold tens. It's kind of unlikely, but I mean, they're going to have a better hand, like a hand that dominates nines, maybe. I don't know, 5 to 10% of the time. It's like a decent chunk of their opening range is those very biggest pairs. So just the presence of this original raiser is really reducing your EV substantially. Even this already a marginal spot, just shoving against this person's range. But the risk of this person waking up with a big hand is significant.
Yeah, I'll note that the 3-better size is probably a little bit too big given the stack of the opponent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
5.5 is probably more appropriate in Roswell's shoes.
Yeah.
I think Roswell ends up being a somewhat nittier player as well, which I don't know if 1947 is his birth date, but
Yeah, could be.
I've commented on Sis, maybe being tighter because of that 25 big blind stack, but they've been opening quite a few pots.
Yeah.
Maybe the worst pair I'm opening here.
Yeah, I think so.
C-betting in multi-way pots in general, you want to do less of. I think under pair to the board is particularly unappealing. Even with the spade, I still don't think this is even close to being a bet.
Agreed.
It's nice seeing the flop check through. I don't think it's enough to conclude. Like, this is still such a bad betting hand that I think this is a spot where many people bet too often. They kind of think, well, so there's two mistakes. One is just the presumption of I probably have the best hand, therefore I bet. And the latter does not necessarily follow from the former. Like, even if it's true that you have the best hand here more than half the time, that doesn't make betting profitable. I mean, you are interested in protecting your hand and getting people to fold, but like the cost of betting is very high. If you bet and get called, you aren't going to lose this pot. So you you are losing most of the money that you put in on a call, and like the value of making worse hands fold is not that high. I mean, if you do have the best hand, you will still have the best hand on the river some amount of the time. So the value of like betting and taking the pot down now is not, like, you're not claiming the entire pot because you have some chance of winning the pot even at showdown. And I know that's not a high chance, and so but you don't want to round that to zero. It is meaningful. But I also think it's easy to overestimate how likely it is that you currently have the best hand. Like in a multi-way pot, there are very good reasons why Suze might be checking a queen here. Either player can be checking a 10. It's possible that either of them has a 7. Like the fact that the flop checked around is really not proof that just like no one has anything.
Agreed.
And I don't even like this river bluff very much from stacked. And as we see, Sis was in fact checking a queen all the way.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I'm mentally making reads here. So I'm thinking stack probably bluffs too much on the river. I didn't mention this earlier because I don't want to mention every little thing for the interest of time. But Roswell made like it was like a pair board, and he bet like I think it might have been like third pot or something. It was a spot where he probably should have min bet, and he went closer to 2 bigs. So I'm kind of like trying to find the guys who have some cracks in their armor. And I think those two guys are probably two of the weaker players, just based on what I've seen so far, which is not much. But I need something. I need something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad that you made that note on stacked.
This is stacked in Roswell, our target so far.
Yeah.
And now we've got Whip limping out of the gun. Although I have a 20 big blind stacked, that's not necessarily a mistake.
Right.
Let's see what ends up happening. The calling, that seems, I mean, there's still some hands that could be tried to do that with, but I think the combination of those three things, I'm a little tempted to put a weak sort of tag on this person as well.
I like it. You can always change it.
Yeah.
So I'd rather have something than nothing. But be just like in real life. Just stereotypes aren't bad unless you don't change them when you get new information.
So just min raising off of this stack, even though I have a hand, that has more interest than some in getting folds or in getting stacks in pre. I also want to induce people to shove as wide as possible. I want them to shove with hands that I dominate, and so betting small is giving myself the most room to have a folding range.
Exactly. And you don't mind so much playing ace king suited post flop if you do get called.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I would have done the same thing with ace king offsuit, but it's,
yeah.
This is a spot I've been working on a lot, and I still don't have the greatest heuristics for this. I think we've talked before, like on the Thinking Poker Daily podcast, among other things, of like many people call too much in this kind of spot broadly, just like when they're in the big blind and there's a raise and a call. Domination is usually a pretty significant concern, and when you look at solver ranges, they're often tighter in a three-way pot than in a heads-up pot when it comes to calling from the big blind. But being really short like this, domination is less of a concern, and it's just a lot easier to realize your equity even at 3-way pot when you're this shallow. So you actually do still do a lot of calling here. Like this is one of those more easily dominated hands that we do start to see dropping out. Like if we had like 40 big blinds here, it's possible this is a fold. I mean, the fact that it can make a straight is some reason to call, but the fact that it's so often dominated is a pretty big problem as you get deeper. But when you're this shallow, that's not really a problem. You can just get it in when you flop a decent pair, and consequently, I think this is not really close. I think it is I mean, it's close in the sense that calling is not like real high value, but I think this is solidly a call, especially when you're still in the reentry period.
Okay, I'm gonna say that this is one of those spots where I don't know where that line is, where you can say I'm short enough to where, the fear of being dominated is not that big of a deal. Like at least in heads up pots, I kind of get to that point once I get to below 10 bigs. And I feel like that might need to be higher when it's a multi-way pot. So that's one thought that's going through my mind. And another thought that's going through my mind is this like fairly new movement that I think Ben CB, I'll give him credit for starting, is like this understanding of how early in tournaments the ICM starts to affect your ranges. So one of the things that he's been saying a lot lately is the chippy V ranges that we tend to use from these pre-flop charts aren't accurate because they aren't taking ICM into account, which we know that's the case when you get close to a bubble. But he's saying, no, it's actually even, relevant much earlier in the tournament. So I got that in the back of my mind, and he's talking about heads up situations. So I imagine it's even more of an impact in multi-way situations. So I'm combining that with the fact that I don't know where that, stack size cutoff is, and the fact that I'm not as good post flop as you are, to put it. So my final answer is, with all those things swirling around in my head, I would not call in this spot, but I'm not confident to say that you shouldn't call in this spot.
Interesting. So this, you can see I pulled up, and this is not the exact situation that I was in, because these other players have ranges that might be different from if they had 15 big blinds. But just using the 15 big blind model, this is actually tighter than I was expecting. I would not have expected king 8 offsuit to be a fold here. So it looks like the domination is still a concern. Some of that might also be that we're looking at the raise coming from earlier position, where they're going to have a lot more if we were looking at like cutoff button big blind, I think we would see more defending, because then again domination becomes less of a concern. If we bring it down to 12, we're actually not calling that much more. Even at 12 big blinds, we're even calling less.
Yeah, I think people tend to underestimate how big of a deal it is to play multi-way pots with these sort of hands. Like, it just kind of destroys it caps your equity so much that it makes it really hard to play wide ranges.
Yeah, so there's actually, like, if we look at 75 big blinds compared to 50, compared to 40, we see ranges getting wider as we get shallower. But then, so we get to 30, but then it starts going in the opposite direction, like 25, 20, 15, 12. We're actually getting tighter again. And I think what's happening there is that because we're shoving more hands, our calling range doesn't our calling range ends up being more vulnerable, because like at 30 big blinds, we're not doing quite as early. 30, 40 big blinds, we're not doing as much 3-betting. Once we get down to 15, 12, then we're not calling with as many stronger hands, and so consequently we can't call with quite as many weaker hands also. This is the best explanation I can find for this.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. The only thing I would add, just based on what I've learned recently, is because this chart isn't taking into account that we're 5+ hours into a tournament, we may even want to shave off the worst hands here. And I would say it's probably
we are still in the reentry period though. So I think you're right. In a normal tournament where 5 hours in means you can't reenter anymore. But I think if I can reenter, the ICM is not going to be a consideration.
Okay, I'll take your word for that. I'll take your word for that.
So Closer than I thought. I mean, it's also worth pointing
Yeah.
out that chart is assuming a min raise, and this is a 2.2x.
Yes.
So I am getting a less good price than what the chart was assuming. But 10-8 was also not the cutoff on the chart. 10-7 was a pure call. Jack-8 was or no, 9-8 was a pure call. So there were weaker hands that were pure calling.
Right.
This is another thing I'm not entirely sure. Like, it was nice that you gave me props for like playing well after the flop. In these really short spots, I don't know for sure if there is a better option. Like, it could be that, betting small is a slightly higher EV option, or checking is a slightly higher EV option. The main, like, I think against weaker players, checking is often better because the original raiser will probably see that too often. Like, especially with having a really short stack like me in the big blind, their c-bet frequency here, I think, is supposed to be surprisingly low. I think a lot of people might just sort of look at the flop and be like, well, I'm the pre-flop raiser, so I get to bet the flop, and not really understand the problem of betting into multiple people, including a short big blind, and how much they're going to get check raised. So if you believe that the original raiser will see that too often, or that the other player is overly aggressive, then I think there could be a case for checking. The problem with checking, of course, is that this is a hand that suffers a lot from seeing a check around. Right now, I have a great hand that I'm thrilled to get the rest of my stack in with, and if it goes check check, most turns I'm not going to feel nearly as good about putting 1.5x pot in.
No, I think you're correct here. And also, we'll take into account what we've been kind of saying about Roswell. He's going to be a bit of a tighter player, so he's going to be less likely to bet when check two than most. So I'm definitely going to do the same thing you did here.
In addition to bluffing too much, I think some people in this player's shoes as the original raiser might bet too often with hands like pocket fives or pocket sevens, ace six, the kind of it where they just sort of say, well, I probably have the best hand, so I bet. The same thing we were talking about earlier. And those are the hands, or that's one type of hand that we would not like to get the opportunity to check through. But if people are going to mistakenly bet those, and they're not terrible betting hands, but I don't think they're supposed to be like full frequency bets. So people who are just kind of blindly betting those, they're going to be better candidates for check raising.
Yeah. And we haven't seen any indication that this guy overbets or bets too often.
Yeah.
So I like.
I've had him on a c-bet of 80, which is on the high side.
That is true.
But that's not all
30
opportunities from this tournament. That's some past hands I have on them as well.
And it's 30 opportunities, but it's not 30 opportunities on this board three-way.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I like your play here.
Now, having only 20 big blinds and having a very short stack behind me, I do go for the button limp with aces. I think this is an appropriate time to have a limping range anyway. To be honest, I mean, I don't know that I'm like finding all of my weak limps in the situation as plausible as I'm finding a limp with aces. But I do also think that people probably attack these limps a little wider than they should. Or, I mean, one of the things you're hoping for, of course, is just getting extra action pre-flop as a result of limping. But I also think that people really struggle, even if they are suspicious and they kind of think like, oh, that's probably a strong hand that he's limping with there on the button. Even if someone correctly has that thought, they still really struggle to get away when they flop something that looks good. It's very hard for them to take into account like, oh, there's like, I mean, if they were to say, and this probably isn't true, but if they believed like, oh, there's a 50% chance that guy has pocket aces, like they should be a lot more conservative with a hand like top pair after the flop. And I think a lot of people just don't have the discipline to do that. So giving them the chance to get into trouble, I'm willing to be a little exploitative to do that.
Yeah, and we do have a little bit of history with the guy on your left where he jammed over your small blind complete before.
Yeah.
Not exactly the same thing, but he's seen you make some passive plays before that he's been able to attack.
And the key thing about being shallow is that this is not the end of the world. I mean, it's not what I was hoping for to have a limp, but seeing the flop with an SPR of like a little over 4, this is still a hand in a three-way pot, especially against 2 blinds. I can feel comfortable stacking off no matter what the flop is. So it's not a disaster to let this happen.
Right.
At this point, I think it probably makes sense to bet just because I think betting is the weakest thing I can do. Like, I clearly have a much stronger range than these two people do. I VPIP'd, and I mean, small line kind of VPIP'd, but it was just a complete. So I think it would be pretty weird for me if I had a bad hand here to not bet. So I think checking to a thinking player, checking is basically just telling them, like, I have a hand that doesn't need to bluff. I think betting small is like the weakest thing I could do in this situation. It's what I would want to do if I had like a, I don't know, 9-8 of clubs.
Agreed.
Probably doesn't matter much here whether I shove or call, but to the extent that he's bluffing, I would like to give him room to keep doing that. In the sense that like some hands he might have been feeling good about before, he's no longer feeling so good about. But I got pretty lucky that he, this I know I mentioned before people like overplaying their hands. This of course is totally reasonable on his part. He just got unlucky to get coolered in this way, but. Well, I meant to get coolered and then get drawn out. I guess I was the one who got coolered and then he got drawn out.
He didn't get too. You manufactured that cooler by limping pre-flop. So I would give you credit there as opposed to just saying this is like aces versus kings pre-flop. Not that sort of cooler.
So this one, actually, I think I had noticed, like, if we look at stacked U has a fold to 3 bet 26 out of 27. Again, not all that is from this tournament. This is information that I had while we were playing. This hand is, I think these like offsuit aces are decent candidates for 3-betting at this stack depth, because one of the things you have to worry about at this stack depth is that you are opening yourself up to a shove. Where at like 75 big blind, this is a less appealing 3-bet because your 3-bets get called a lot more often. At a stack depth like this, there's a fair amount of shoving, or I would expect a fair amount of shoving from people, and so I would kind of rather have ace-7 offsuit than like ace-5 suited, which I'm going to fold to a shove. So this is like the kind of hand that I would consider 3-betting with, and I'm not like always 3-betting blindly no matter who the opponent is, but when I see now that this person has a fold to 3-bet of 96, and I think this is already a close decision, even at equilibrium between call versus 3-bet, then 3-betting just becomes very appealing.
I agree with that. And yeah, so basically my understanding is you want to choose a polarized range containing hands like this when you don't expect it to go post flop very often.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this is like a perfect candidate given how often he folds here. Where if he's a guy who calls 3-bets too much, maybe you want to just go a little bit more depolarized in this spot.
Yeah, and let's actually, I mean, if we just look at this is like 40 big blind low jack raise versus big blind, you can see that this is I mean, I don't know how obvious it is just looking at this chart that this is what a polarized range, but
yeah.
There are the very strong hands that are happy to stack off, which is like the 9s plus ace king, and then there are these the bluffs are not king queen suited, not ace jack suited, like those, not ace 5 suited. These are not hands that want to raise fold. The bluffs are some of these weaker suited hands and some of these weaker offsuit. I think like ace queen is going to be raise calling, ace jack might be raise folding, but that also has less value as a call just because it misses so many flops compared to like ace jack suited is never raising. So the hands that are going to raise fold are hands that have less value as calls. And you see a7 is a candidate, and then the way I'm interpreting this, like I'm not randomizing this. I'm understanding that this is a candidate for both calling and raising, and then I'm looking at this person's stats and saying like, oh, raising seems very appealing against this person. They clearly fold too often to 3-bets.
Definitely. Love it.
Our buddy Roswell is in there. This strikes me as still a little too weak to call from the small blind, but I suspect I might be a little too tight from the small blind from looking at solver charts, but again, we do have a very short stack behind us.
Yeah, I fold here. He's probably open a little bit tighter than he should be, and like you said, the small stack in the big blind is a concern. Yeah, I don't think we need to get involved there.
He's got his pre-flop raise of 12, so yeah, we'll let him have it. Maybe a decision without Roswell in there 3-betting, but certainly an easy fold once Roswell 3-bets.
Yeah, that guy has a high fold to 3-bet as well.
Roswell getting spicy all of a sudden, but okay.
He's getting hit with the deck all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think 3s is actually not a hand that I would open from that spot, although it's close.
I agree with that. So this is one of those spots where I think he may just not be aware that you can't open it there. I don't think he's purposely open wider than the charts.
Yeah,
he probably
he just
thinks
that.
It's
like, oh yeah,
exactly.
Which I mean, that was me 3 years ago. Like,
yeah, seeing 3s here is a lot different than seeing like 10-6 suited here.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, do we get to play with him this time?
I would not.
Yeah, I mean, we still have the Caballero problem behind us. We also have somewhat short stack in the big blind. Like Zeus can shove somewhat wide. I don't remember what I did here, but looking at it now, I hope I'm folding. If I didn't fold, 3-bet might actually be the next best option. Even if I call, I would still call whip if everyone else folded. A 3-bet still gives me room to fold to Suze, and it denies him the opportunity to call. Roswell does have a fold to 3-bet of 100, although that's over a very small sample. So I think probably fold better than 3-bet, better than call.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, full marks.
Good.
Let's see not showdown, but that seemed pretty strong there, betting that board into multiple people.
Yeah.
Again, one of the weakest pairs that I'm opening from this spot.
Yep.
Maybe 6s, but not 5s. Not folding a lot in the big blind to a small late position raise, but deuce offsuit is an especially bad hand. And as you said, I think we're probably out of the reentry period now, or at least close to it. And I have more than a starting stack now, so I think ICM, like, even if I did bust and reenter, I'm not reentering with as many chips. So I think there is sort of like some ICM pressure on the amount of chips that I have above and beyond the starting stack.
Right.
What do we think here?
I think this is good enough because, well, before you pointed out his fold to 3-bet, which again we probably don't want to read too much into because it's only 3 opportunities. I was gonna say this guy probably doesn't have as many raise folds as the other guys, and so for that reason, you want a more depolarized range. And so I think this hand could fit in a depolarized range given his cutoff open, and I guess we can give a little bit of weight to his like last orbit or so. So I would lean towards 3-betting here.
Yeah, it feels pretty close to me. I just wanted to see. I mean, this is very much not the situation we're in because we have a very short stack in the big blind, and that's going to affect things. But if we were just looking at like cutoff raise and we're in the small blind with 40, you can see it as a legitimate choice between call and raise with king jack offsuit.
Yeah. And we do have new evidence that he opened at 3s in a spot where he shouldn't. So we do know his range isn't as strong as a chart would suggest. But I don't think that means he's necessarily going to fold. So if he's going to be raise calling with stuff like 3s, I'd rather have a hand like king jack than like an 8-7.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I did go for the 3-bet here, in part because with whip being short, there's extra value in not like he gets to overcall, like we just talked about. He does get to overcall realize equity better, I guess, when he is when he's short. So there are some hands that he might not be able to justify calling at a higher stack depth that he can when he only has 10 big blinds. And if I'm going to call his shove anyway, I would kind of rather raise and not give him the opportunity to call and realize equity from this big blind.
Yep. So my adjustment here would be to, like, I still think Roswell is too tight, but that doesn't mean he's not opening loose from the cutoff. So I'm probably not going to go too crazy versus middle position or early position opens, but everybody opens, well, most people open looser from late position, and we've seen evidence that he does from his showdown with 3s, and now also that small sample size of raised folds he's done, which I assume most of those are from late position also. So that's the one spot we can still feel comfortable attacking him.
Yeah, I mean, Roswell is since we last looked at it, his PFR has jumped from 12 to 20. This is actually positional PFR, so 25% early position, 67% middle position, and then this is a cutoff button small blind.
Yeah, and here's something else. His and I didn't mention this earlier. It's funny. Like a lot of this stuff is becoming automatic for me, which is kind of sweet. Earlier when we talked about his 3-bet size being too big, to me, that's kind of a sign of a tight player also.
Yeah.
And then there was also a spot where his C-bet size was too big. So I've kind of factored. So I'm not just looking at the stats to determine that this guy's too tight. There's like some other minor things I'm factoring in as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Open queen jack off, fold to a small blind 3-bet. I think this one maybe was close in theory. I still like erring on the side of folding, but like
What was your hand again?
queen jack offsuit. So I open.
Yeah,
We've got a small
yeah.
blind 3-bet. Yeah, mix of calls and folds, but I think that's especially with the extra ICM implications. I like just erring on the side of folding. A lot of people are overly tight in this spot. Like this guy has a 3 out of 3. So
yeah.
you can have that one, Jeff. Just like you've taken so much else from me. As I mentioned, now that we're dealing with a shorter stack open, I'm using a smaller 3-bet. This is not specifically because I have kings, although it's not irrelevant. Like kings, of course, is a hand I'm going to want to 3-bet, and with shallower stacks, you can 3-bet a smaller size with kings and still get the SPR that you want after the flop. Whereas if we were like 75 big blinds deep, I'm not going to get the SPR that I want with some of these bigger pairs. I'm not getting as much money pre-flop in as I want with these bigger pairs using a smaller 3-bet size. But that doesn't mean that I'm using this size because I have kings. I'm using any hand I'm going to 3-bet here. I'm going to use this size, and just when this person is shallower, we should expect that they're shoving somewhat more often over the 3-bet, and consequently we want to risk less on our raise folds, and we're less concerned about the calling price we're offering them because somewhat, I mean, they still have a calling range, but like somewhat fewer hands are going to call as it becomes more appealing for them to shove.
Yeah, they also have a high fold to 3-bet.
Yeah, very high.
Decent sample size too.
But we got them this time.
Yep. Or they got us. So, okay.
And there's so many situations where your 3-bet size doesn't matter. Like if they have tens, it doesn't. I could have made it 8 or 5 or whatever else, and that's just we're getting the same result no matter what.
Right.
This is kind of an interesting one. My min raise king queen off under the gun. I get called by Stack 2, who I initially had tagged red for that one like aggressive bluff we saw on the river, but overall this person has showed up with fairly tight stats thus far, including this now up folded 3-bet is up to 97 since the A7 incident.
Yeah.
I'm still pretty inclined to just bet this flop. I think a lot of people are going to be under aggressive when checked too. Even at a position, you do want to give a little more thought to checking. But I think this hand in particular, like if this person has a pocket pair or whatever, they're going to call. There's not an obvious way. Like if they don't have anything, there's not really a turn card that I'm rooting for. I guess like a queen or a jack is pretty good in terms of giving them a pair, but it also puts some straight potential on the board. So I think a lot of hands are going to give me action, are going to give action to a bet, and hands that aren't going to give action, there's not necessarily a lot of benefit to just like checking to them.
Yeah, I agree with that. And earlier, that spot where we tagged him as aggressive, he bluffed river after flop and turn check through. Yeah. So he's not necessarily going to just bet the flop when you check to him. But yeah. I mean, if it checks 3 times, he might bet the river too much. That's been his MO. But this hand is too strong for that.
Mm-hmm. So I come out of the gate betting, calls, turn is a 3. I think I did at least consider checking at this point because I do think that there's a kind of person who bets too often in this situation when they're checked to, where they just kind of think like, okay, I want to take it down now. Essentially, like people who have that attitude of like betting to take it down. I want to give them like if they're going to bet with like pocket sixes, so, okay, I just want to take the pot down. I don't want to see any more cards. Like that kind of thought process. Those people I think are very good to check to. I don't remember what I ended up doing here, but does that hold water for you?
I do that all the time. That's one of my favorite things to do. It's like there's certain people who I play against that it feels like they flat me in position every single time I open, to the point where I have a hand that's on the cusp that I'll fold because they're behind me, and then they fold, and I'm 100% sure that had I opened, they would have opened, whatever. Like they're only calling because I'm in there because they're looking to like float me and take it away when I check on the turn. So against those player types, I really like that line you're suggesting.
Okay, so I didn't go for it this time. I think I just decided if he had a king, he wasn't going to fold for a pot bet, and I wanted to try to play a big pot with him.
Yeah.
Once again, I think this feels kind of borderline in terms of defending from the blinds, especially because I am quite deep. I think I had concluded that Roswell wasn't that great of a player, and so I was a little less concerned about my equity realization versus them as I would be against a different person. And so even if this is maybe like borderline where Solver's concerned, it probably isn't against the button raise anyway. But I think I also am expecting to have less difficulty against Roswell.
I agree with that.
So it's pretty straightforward. Fold once there's a bet and a call, and I have no piece of the board.
Only a couple of hands, but the guy on your immediate right, well, up until that last hand, his VPIP was only 10, but it jumped to 18 after that hand.
Yeah.
So I was going to say he might be a little bit too tight also, and I think that can make it easier for you to get the showdown.
What are your thoughts on 3-betting versus calling here?
I think I'll go ahead and 3-bet just because we know he folds a lot to 3-bet. And like I would not 3-bet king queen suited, but like if I'm gonna play post flop out of position against an aggressive player, I want a hand with better. I want to play post flop with a hand that has better ability to get the showdown than this one. So I'll probably use this as a 3-bet, but king queen suited I would call.
Yeah, I was just gonna look here. This is for the solver, like a under the gun +1 raise, 50 big blinds effective. It's doing the opposite and is calling with the king queen and 3-betting the king queen suited. And I think that's probably because in a 3-bet pot with king queen, you still can't feel that good about stacking off with just top pair. So having the extra like flush potential is making this more appealing as a 3-bet. But I don't know. I mean, I think the argument you're making makes sense against the person who folds too much. Like king queen offsuit does value the preflop fold more than king queen suited does.
Yeah,
so I think probably I should have 3-bet here.
Yeah, I don't think the chart would want a 3-bet king queen suited if they knew the guy was gonna fold. Like that's a hand I want action with.
Right. One other thing that this is not the world's hugest sample size once we break it down by position, but his early position opening is quite low compared to. I mean, his overall PFR is on the low side, but his early position raise first in is 5.
Yeah, that's a good point. That makes me lean towards not 3-betting this hand. I think, like, I don't love playing this hand post flop, but it's better than having a raise folded, I think.
Mm-hmm. And the big blind comes along, who is, I think, both a person who works in the sex industry as a pornographic performer, but also a pretty serious poker player.
Yeah. Also, I would say his biggest claim to fame is the rap industry. He's a hip hop podcaster.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
A man of many talents.
Yes. Several industries he has his finger amongst other digits in.
This is a spot I'm really not sure about. Donk betting in general, I think you can pretty safely avoid like in heads-up situations. I think it's not a big deal if you're not really exploiting that part of the game tree. I think in multi-way pots, donk betting is a somewhat more important thing. There's not as much like the main reason you don't do a lot of donk betting in heads-up pots is there's usually a pretty strong impetus for the original raiser to c-bet. In a multi-way pot, there's not so clearly one player who like has all the equity and is like really heavily driving the betting. That's less of a thing in multi-way pots. So I truly don't know what like whether a solver would develop a donk betting range here. For that reason, I tend to kind of like shy away from it rather than do something that's potentially really unbalanced, unless I have some particular idea of how I expect my opponents to respond. And one thing that's going through my head here is that although I can feel pretty good about betting and getting called on the flop, there are going to be some turns that are pretty tricky to play if the action goes bet call on the flop. I mean, mostly an ace, a 10, or a 9 are all going to be like fairly tricky turns. So in a world where the flop checks around, we can imagine some turn cards that you're like, oh, gross, I wish I'd bet the flop. But do you really? Like, so if it checks around and the turn is an ace, like, okay, that feels bad. But suppose you bet and got called and the turn was an ace. Does that feel better? I mean, the turn's going to be an ace or it's not. And if it's not, if it checks around and the turn is like an offsuit deuce, then I feel very good about betting the turn in river for value, or like turn in most rivers. Like, I think once I see a blank turn and no action on the flop, I'm going to feel a lot better about starting to pump money into the spot.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I do think you will see a bet more often when the board is big like this. If we were looking at like a 10-9-8 board and you had 10-9, I think there's a much bigger chance that that one checks through.
Mm-hmm. I'm bad. Okay, so this is kind of good news. Don't get raised. I think most better hands would raise. Of course, Adam is also not really going to have sets. Some chance he's slow playing a straight, but I think probably the fact that he's calling and the original raiser is folding is a pretty good outcome for me. I think Adam's going to have a lot more either just like one pair hands. Like I think for Adam to call here with like, I don't know, Queen 8 would be pretty bad. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know a lot about this person other than those biographical details that we just talked about. So I don't know, I think a lot of people would call here with Queen 8. So like, oh, it's a small bet and I have a pair. And I think that's a substantial mistake in a multi-way pot, but I do think a lot of people make that mistake. Whether Adam is one of those people, I don't know. I think more likely they have a draw or pair plus draw.
Yeah, I'm thinking that or like a weak king. I don't think he's just gonna fold like king deuce suited here.
That's true.
So at least for the flop bet, I'm pretty happy to bet small and get called. Rest of this hand could be interesting.
Let's hope it was king deuce.
Yeah.
I think every reason in the world to bet now. A lot of those hands that we're targeting, I mentioned pair plus draw, Queen 9, Jack 10, those hands that have very little incentive to bet when Jack to 2. In fact, I would say it's a disaster for him to bet those when Jack to 2. So those hands are also going to be reluctant to fold because they have equity even against them. Even though it is going to look pretty strong to bet here, he still has hands that even knowing we have a strong hand, he's not going to want to give up one like those pair plus draws. So I think betting here and betting on the larger side is pretty important.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Maybe even larger than this is called for.
I agree with that as well.
And I think I'm expecting to get a lot of folds on the river. I mean, all those pair plus draw hands have missed. I've shown a lot of strength, but I don't think checking is really doing myself any favors. I think if I check, he's just checking behind Queen 9 or whatever. So the best thing I can do is like give him a good price and hope he pays off with one of those hands.
Yeah, I agree with that as well.
Nope. Once again, raise folding Queen Jack, cut off versus small blind. I think even the same player.
Yep. It feels so good, man, to late reg and then run up a stack. It feels like you just cheated everybody. Like everybody else had to be here for 5 hours and you just come in and you're like, above, like, well, you're like, you're above most people in the tournament, I think.
I played it, I think it was like 1 or 2 weeks ago. Literally, I tripled up the first hand and I just like sat right down and like had an average stack after one hand. It was beautiful.
So awesome.
Yeah, so this is a one of the best possible flops you could ask for as an under the gun raiser playing against the big blind, mostly because it doesn't do anything to change the pre-flop range dynamic. It's not really about who has a king more often, although the answer is you, but really just because you already have a big range advantage as the under the gun raiser versus the big blind. So any flop that doesn't disrupt, like this could be 3-3 king, it's still a really good flop for you, even though he's going to have threes and you aren't, just because neither of you has a 3 very often. So really the important thing is just that the flop didn't do much to promote a range that was starting off much weaker than yours. The really bad flops for you are the ones that would be like 9-7-6, like the kind of thing that is going to promote a lot of this person's weaker range. A flop that nobody hits very often is good for you as the under the gun raiser. And this one, where you also have the nuts advantage in terms of having more good kings than the big blind does, that's just like icing on the cake.
Yeah.
So this is like a really tiny c-bet with range spot.
Yep.
What I think is less clear is how do you proceed after making that small bet on the flop. So we should assume a few things. I mean, one, Xander just has to fold a lot to that small bet. Even like, they're not even supposed to be defending at like a minimum defense frequency. So there's a lot of hands, including hands we're happy to get folds from, like a Queen 9 of diamonds or something. Like those hands are just even to a tiny bet, those hands are mostly just folding. But even when they do call, they still don't have a super strong range. Even they're like calling, even if it's only like 30% of hands or something that they're calling with, that's still is going to have a lot of unpaired hands. Obviously, like any 3 is calling. So it's still not like they have a super strong range at this point. The 6 is not improving very much of their range. So I still think there's some protection value from betting. there are hands like 10-9 of hearts that I would expect to peel the flop, but that have like backdoor draws. And now those have missed their backdoor draws, so I do want to get folds from those. There's still plenty of second best hands that can call me as long as I bet small enough. So I think this is a rare instance where we want to bet smallish again on the turn. We don't see that super often. Commonly, you see like small bet on flop, a small depolar bet on the flop, followed by like more polarized turn strategy where you either bet big or check. And I think here we're retaining such a big range advantage that there are still reasons to have a small betting, a range that uses a small bet size. And I think eights slots pretty nicely into that range.
Yeah, 100% agree. It's just like everything from the flop just got transferred over to the turn. It's like the exact same stuff. Like this size is probably too big based on what you said.
Perfect, he called.
Yeah.
He would have folded for 3.96, I asked him.
Yeah.
And then I think river, especially with it being an overcard to the eights, becomes a check back. We've now strengthened his range. Like if we think about what were the reasons for betting the turn, part of it was protection. You know, getting like Jack 10 of hearts to fold. Now the river's Jack, we don't have to worry about that Jack 10 of hearts being in there anymore. So we got the protection we were going to get by betting the flop in the turn. We strengthened his range by betting the flop in the turn. And once we get to the river, there's not as much reason for him to call with second best hands anymore. There's not draws. There's we're showing more and more strength. There's a new threat for him to be aware of. We're opening ourselves up to a check raise, which is dangerous. So I think if you're dealing with a really like kind of straightforward loose passive player, you can probably get another value bet in here. But I think my default is to check.
Yeah, I like checking here.
This person having tight stats is supporting that.
Yeah, yeah. Now I don't know if ACR is going to show this, but I also want to see what he called down with. It's going to make a big difference to me whether he called down here with ace high versus like a 3 or a 6.
That's a great point. Or it was just trapping with a king.
Yeah, yeah. I guess we don't learn
honestly,
too
like
much
having
there.
a bad kicker, I think that's fine on his part. Like, I don't think his hand is a great candidate for raising.
Yeah, I think he played his hand fine, which kind of like, you know, I guess that's like a little less important information that we get from forcing the showdown here. Like finding out that the guy played his hand fine doesn't really help us. But like, you know, if he showed down ace deuce off here, that would tell me a decent amount.
That hand we just saw from Roswell, they see about 1/3 pot, which we had not previously seen from, and like in a pretty reasonable spot. They 3-bet and then they see that 1/3 pot. We commented before on them using an overly large c-bet size, so I just wanted to speak out on their defense there.
Yeah, yeah.
I think solver's call here. I think having the button, I think they expect to get some equity outside. I don't think this is a pure set mine when you're on the button. I still kind of struggle to find value here. I'm curious your thoughts.
I fold. This guy has a high folded 3-bet.
Yeah.
And also the high c-bet, but when he has a high folded 3-bet and he's not as positionally aware as the guy on his right, so he's going to have a lot of hands that can't pay you off when you hit. And so against that guy, you just lose all the times you miss unless you're going to, like, you know, get really spicy with an underpair post flop, which I don't think you're planning to do. Like this is already kind of like one of the smallest stacks I want to be set mining against. And I only want to do it against a nit. And this guy's just going to have too many bluffs for me to want to try to set mine here. So I would fold this.
So you see, with everyone having 25 big blind stacks, which again is not exactly the situation that we're in, but deuces is a mix for the solver, but the other pairs are not folding.
Yeah. So I might be a little bit too tight here with like 3s and 4s.
But again, with the ICM consideration, that probably is appropriate.
Yeah.
Like set mining is one of the higher variance things you can do in terms of like you often lose a small pot and occasionally win a big one, and that's like kind of the opposite of what you want in tournaments.
Yeah, see, here's the thing. It's like the majority of the equity that comes with those small pairs is set mining, and the rest of the equity that comes with them, I'm just not capable of getting.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know when to float with an underpair. I don't know when to check raise with it. Like, that's some stuff I'll be working on in 2030.
King 4 offsuit is a good example of a hand that defends well against a late position open and badly against an early position open. The fact that this person is shallow, it's a little easier to realize your equity. So I think this is certainly a call against the like 15 big blind later position opener, but is not a call even against 15 big blinds from like an under the gun raise.
Okay. I wouldn't, but I think you make a good point.
So against that person, even flopping a 4, even just making a pair of 4s, I can justify playing for stacks on those flops. I mean, probably not if there's an ace on the flop, but like if the flop is like queen 7-4, you have a pretty decent hand because they're a late position opener.
Yeah, I think one thing that's going through my head is that I'm giving them a tighter range because they're opening from such a small stack. Like in that last hand, I think they had like 12 bigs or something.
Yeah.
Or so at some point they're gonna drop out the worst hands in that range, but I guess they might also be shoving with some of that stuff in the middle. So if they are a really aggressive player, they might just lean towards having too much junk in their range. And if they're a tighter player, that might just have too many nuts in their range. So I guess this guy, based on what we've seen from his opening and how often he's folding to 3 bets, he might have a wider range there than a lot of people. So I can kind of see defending and going broke with a 4 versus him.
What you said about shoving too. I mean, if you think about what are the hands that slot most naturally into that shoving range, it's like pocket 6s, pocket 7s, pocket 8s, and those are some of the worst case scenario hands for you. Right? Those are the hands that dominate your 4. So the fact that he's going to have like ace queen in his min raising range is not really a problem for your king 4. You're pretty live against ace queen. You'd much rather run a ace queen than pocket 7s, and 7s is doing more shoving than ace queen is.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is if I think this guy, the question I want to answer for myself is if I think this guy is, if he has a wide range here, like what are those extra hands? And my guess is he's probably opening a lot of like offsuit aces. And against those, you're right. If I kind of know what his range looks like, then I'm more happy to go broke with any pair on a board that doesn't have an ace.
Yeah, that's a great example of targeting. We often talk about targeting in the context of betting, of like, well, when you're bluffing, what's your target? What are you trying to make them fold? Or you're value betting, what are you trying to make them call? But I think what you're saying is like when you're calling, what are the hands that you're targeting? Like what are the hands that you're profiting from when you call? And thinking about whether or not those are going to be in the opener's range and in what proportion is the determining factor on whether or not the call makes sense. Like understanding where that value comes from, not just I'm calling because the solver says so, but understanding like I'm calling because there's this portion of the opponent's range that I profit from by calling.
And you know what? I'm so glad you said that because I haven't thought about it in terms of targeting, but I'm gonna start doing that now. But a spot where I've started doing this is when a tight guy opens from a short stack, and I'm in the big blind with a weak ace. Like that's a spot where I used to fold a lot because I'm thinking like this tight guy's gonna have like ace king, ace queen a lot. I'm not gonna know if I'm good if I hit. But he's also just gonna have like kings and queens and jacks a lot more so than something like say ace 7 offsuit. So my ace, if I hit it, is not gonna be dominated that much if he's only opening the biggest aces. I'm just gonna hit a lot of times when he just has like an underpair that was previously like the second or third nuts, and that's a decent situation for me.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. This is an interesting one. I think I can actually justify getting this in against Suze. With the this is essentially the same thing as shoving on Suze.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm not shoving, of course, is that there's a guy behind me who covers me. So like I don't want to risk 70 big blinds against Adam. I am okay risking 18 big blinds against Suze when I also have fold equity. So essentially what I'm doing here by 3-betting smaller, I'm giving myself room to not lose 70 big blinds to Adam. and I'm also giving Suze the opportunity to call. And so that's a risk and a reward. I mean, the reward is I'm not taking on as much risk against Adam, or not even, you know, I guess another option would be I could 3 that to like 9 or something, where I'm obviously not folding to Suze, but that also is just like increasing my risk against Adam. And in theory, like I can still have a small 3 that fold. Like I don't want 3 that fold very often for after I put this much in, but like in theory, I could have like an ace-4 offsuit or something with like 3 that fold against Suze.
I'll tell you something I used to do. This was a long time ago. I used to click it on these guys a lot with air.
Just like make it 3.
Yeah,
That's
like yeah, because like it's basically those guys I identified earlier, the guys who don't have the middle of their range because they would jam it. Not from this stack size. I'm thinking more like say 12 to 15, maybe from like cutoff or button. Guys who open a lot from those stack sizes in a spot where they would clearly be jamming with like their medium pairs. The guys that open a lot, they have a lot of stuff below the medium pairs. And the guys who don't open enough have the stuff above the medium pairs. So depending on which type of opponent I was against, if I was against the guy who had a bunch of bluffs in that spot, I would just like min 3-bet and they would fold. Like I remember famously doing this once with like 8-3 suited, and the guy folded. He was opening like 9-6 off or something. This was like ignition, so the players were really bad. But this was years ago, and like there's some guys I can literally click it with 8-3 offsuit against, and then there's other guys I could probably fold jacks against because they would be open jamming 10s, and so the raising range was just like pairs above. Yeah, it was very specific, but it was probably like so specific that it wasn't good, but you know, at least it was fun. I got away from it for a reason, but to your point, not only do we have that extreme fold equity here because this guy raised folds a lot, we also have a hand that can get it in against him. So yeah, this works both ways again with this in this situation.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that like I'm not hoping for a shove. I'm accepting that I'm not going to get blown off of my equity by a shove. Like a shove is not good for me. I want to fold. So I think sometimes people are like, well, I don't want to 3-bet here because I don't want him to shove. And it doesn't quite fly. Like I don't want him to shove, but I am going to call.
Yeah. And you gotta remember that we're getting folds like, you know, maybe like 90% of the time in this situation, but I guess probably still around like 70 at a minimum.
I was going to say 67.
Yeah, so we're making our money there, and then at this point, it's just a math question if he does jam.
He does take advantage of the pot odds and calls.
This is where I get confused.
Say that again?
This is where I get confused.
Yeah, so let's think this through. I mean, I think there are very few strong hands that are incentivized to do this. Aces, kings, that's about it. Like, even once you get down to queens, it's like it's very easy for an overcard to queens to flop, and that's a disaster when he has the stack size. Like the flop is king 7 deuce, and like even with SPR1, you don't feel that good about putting your stack in with queens, but you also don't feel that good about folding it. It's just it's an awful spot to be in, and there's so many hands, and queens is the 3rd best hand there is, and already that hand is uncomfortable. So I think like the possibility that he's trapping is there. I would absolutely, if I'm him, I would play aces this way, I would play kings this way, but I don't think it's an appealing way to play ace king. I don't think it's an appealing way to play queens. So I think this is mostly honest. You know, I think it's mostly hands that are not good enough to shove pre-flop that want to take advantage of the price and the opportunity to play after the flop in position.
So what are we thinking? Like medium suited broadways, queen jack suited, jack 10 suited.
Yeah, I think queen jack suited is like the like
quintessential.
Yes, that's the word. The quintessential hand.
Yeah.
Paradigmatic. What was I think the one I was thinking of, but they both work.
That sucks.
Yeah, but it's an opportunity, right? Like the fact that maybe he would have folded, like if he has I don't know, jack 10 suited, maybe he would have folded to the shove, and so now he's winning the pot. But we also, if it is king queen suited that wasn't going to fold to the shove, getting to see the flop is worth something to us as well. And now we can find out like, oh, this is a flop where I'm glad I don't have another 13 big blinds in the pot.
Yeah, I really like that.
So I'm not looking to see that. Right? This is not like, oh, I threw that pre-flop, so now I have to see that. Like, this is why we do that work of articulating what does his range look like pre-flop, because, you can't, you don't have a huge range advantage here. He does have those big pairs in there that are beefing up his equity, and then he also has a lot of Broadway cards that connect with this board, and he's not folding a jack, so you're not going to get him to fold very many better hands. If he has sevens, maybe you can get him off of that, but that probably shoves pre.
Yeah, hand rating, that's the thing. It's pretty fun.
And it's getting uglier and uglier. But wait, now he's checked twice. Bluffs are hard to find in this situation. If you think about my 3-betting range, my range is also loaded up with Broadway cards. It's pretty rare that I'm going to have a hand like this is about as bad as my hand could possibly be on this board, given that I threw that pre-flop.
Yeah.
I think this is a bluff and not especially close. This is a spot I would expect to be a plus EV bluff. Because it's so hard to find bluffs in this spot that you're really not like this. It's a pretty rare spot that's not going to come up that often, like with him having checked back the flop and turn. So it's not really a spot where it makes sense to like construct earlier street ranges around anticipating. Even if you can anticipate I'm going to get some profitable bluffs in this sort of spot, you can't really like 3-bet more bad hands just hoping to get like this confluence of events. So what ends up happening is that in the rare event that you do hold a weak hand in this kind of situation, it is downright profitable to bluff. Like you are unbalanced in this spot. You are not going to have enough bluffs, and your opponent is supposed to overfold because even knowing that they're going to overfold, you're just not incentivized to show up here with more bluffs. So I think it's important to be asking yourself like, what would my bluffs be in this situation? And I think a hand like this just absolutely has to be in there. There is a question of size.
Well, before we get to that question, I guess this will help answer that question. What's our target?
I think hands as good as 2-pair. And I'm representing that I have a 10.
Which 2-pair? Or all 2 pairs?
That's a good question. I mean, I think if I go for stacks, if I put them all in, I think I either have a straight or a bluff. I don't think I'm doing that with ace king or pocket aces. Maybe I can get with aces. I mean, I think a solver might go a little thinner for value.
Wait a minute. The question is, what are we targeting with our bluff? Not necessarily our range. So you said 2-pair. I'm thinking queen jack makes sense.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it matters. Like any 2-pair is the same hand once we're shoving.
My point is a lot of those 2 pairs don't get to the river the way this guy did.
Oh, I gotcha.
So like ace king, that's a 2-pair we can maybe make fold here, but he doesn't have ace king. King jack, think he slow plays that this far?
No.
Like queen jack makes a lot of sense. Queen jack is definitely a hand that's very prevalent in his range, and it's one I can see him playing this way. The other 2 pairs, I just don't think he has.
Yeah, I guess I would throw out there like king 9 suited, queen 9 suited, pocket sevens, ace 5 suited. Like there are some 1-pair hands. That's part of the problem. The other reason why you're so incentivized to bluff at the bottom of your range is that like sometimes you can't even beat hands from your opponent's perspective that are just garbage. Now that might be a reason to use a smaller size. Like I think if we're mostly
that's
trying
what
to
I'm getting at.
Yeah. I don't remember what size I did bluff here. I don't remember whether I went for stacks or whether I did like half pot. I think those are probably the choices.
Yeah, if we think queen jack.
No, come on. I really thought I bluffed here.
I love the post flood the post game study pain because like
I was so confused. I was like, wait till people see this brilliant bluff I made.
But what's so great about that pain you feel is that you will never forget it. Like this is where the learning happens. That in that pain, because you really, especially now that we're recording and we're revealing to the world, you will never miss this bluff again in your entire life.
It's so important to find your bluffs here.
But just to finish this statement, so if we think the only 2-pair he gets to this river with is queen jack, but we also want to target some 1-pair hands, then I think that's going to lead us to the correct size, which in my experience, estimation, would be a small bet here.
Yeah, even smaller than half. You think like third or something?
I might just go half, just because I don't want like half is. Yeah, honestly, I'll take the exact number I would go. 7. I want it to be half mathematically, but I want it to look bigger than half. So like 7 looks a lot bigger than 6.99 on this board. So yeah, I think if we go 7, we get the guy off of like Jack 9 suited type hands all day. If we go like third, he might find a call with like say like a king, maybe. I don't know what people call in this spot, but I feel like and I'll give Alex credit for this because I think I heard this from Alex. The extra chip that you put on top. Say if you were gonna go like 5 versus 7, those extra the two big blinds is a good buy. Like you get the extra fold equity you get there is a good buy for that price. So yeah, I would go exactly 7 on this river.
I really wish this was an ignition and we could like see that he has 7s or something here.
Me too. Yeah, because that's additional pain. That sears it into your I don't know what part of the brain is where the memory is, but hippocampus or something like that. It sears it on there. Yeah.
Or 7-6 suited, like even a hand that we were ahead of, like we should literally never be winning the spot after checking because he should also be finding those rare bluffs. If he does have a hand that can't beat 5s, he should be bluffing with it. So we should literally never get to showdown, even if we have the best hand.
Okay, thank you for watching, everyone. Once again, the full version, which is another 10 plus hours of the high quality strategy content that you just saw, is available at www.knitcast.net, and you can use discount code VenomTV to get an additional 25% off. Thanks and enjoy.